Okay, good evening, everybody. My name is Philip Kelly. I'm the director of the York Centre for Asian Research, and I'd like to welcome you all to this event this evening. Welcome to those of you who've decided to stay late after classes. We're very glad that you did. And a special welcome to those of you who are visiting York. Thank you for visiting us, and thank you for finding us. Rest assured that in 3 years' time, when we celebrate the 30th anniversary of the EDSA revolution, you'll all be able to come here in the comfort of your own subway car, rather than coming to a hole in the ground. But thank you for finding us. We know it's a challenge, and so we're always grateful when people come and visit us at York. The idea for this panel came about a year ago, when a group of people came together in a church basement in downtown Toronto to reflect on the 39th anniversary of martial law in the Philippines. And it struck me at that time that the very poignant and powerful stories that were being shared at that event needed to be heard by a wider audience, and especially by a younger audience. That was perhaps unfamiliar with the historical struggles undertaken by an older generation, in some cases their parents' generation, and is perhaps disconnected from the ways in which those struggles continue into the present in the Philippines. And that is the thinking behind this event. So the purpose is to hear testimonies of personal and political struggles of the Philippines past, to reflect on their relevance to the present, and to place them in a wider intellectual and geographical context. So these are our goals this evening. And we have a wonderful panel of speakers for you. If you didn't already grab one, there is a blue sheet at the back that has the program for this evening and the list of speakers. And before I turn over to our moderator, Alex Felipe, I have a few thank yous to extend to the people who helped us put this together. The first thank you goes to Alex himself. Alex created the wonderful photo exhibit, which is over here at the side of the room, that's associated with this event. The photo exhibit has been on display in the library at York, in the main library at York, for the past 2 weeks. And if you haven't already taken a look, please do have a look afterwards. Secondly, I want to thank the community groups who have co-sponsored this event. So they are Migrante-Canada, BAYAN-Canada, and CASJ, or the Community Alliance for Social Justice. And thanks especially go to Ricky Esguerra, who's one of our panelists, and Hermie Garcia from CASJ, who were key figures in making this happen. And I should also say thank you to Ish Cabana, who designed the very striking poster that you'll have seen on the walls and the websites for the event. Thirdly, let me thank Alicia Filipowicz, who is never actually in the room at these events. She's always busy outside organizing something. Alicia is our supremely efficient coordinator at the York Centre for Asia. Oh, she's just popped her head around the door. Alicia is our supremely efficient coordinator at the York Centre for Asian Research. And while I'm plugging the York Centre for Asian Research, I should also mention that we have a yellow sheet at the back of the room. This explains some of the activities in relation to Philippine studies that are going on at York. So a list of recent and current research projects, some of the affiliated researchers who are working on the Philippines, and a few other bits and pieces of information. So do take a look at that if you can. And finally, I want to thank our co-sponsors for this event, the Nathanson Center for Transnational Human Rights, Crime and Security, which is a research center in the Osgoode Hall Law School here at York. They're co-sponsoring our event, as I say. It is thanks to them we have a delicious spread of food. And it's also thanks to the Nathanson Center that we are videotaping tonight's event in order to share it with a wider audience for those who couldn't join us. And in relation to that, I will just mention that the event is being videotaped. The camera is pointing this way. So when you ask your questions, you will be on audio, but you won't actually your face won't be on the camera, unless you'd like it to be, of course. But ordinarily, you won't be filmed while you're asking your questions, and the questions will be asked from this podium here. Oh, and I should mention that the Nathanson Centre's director, François Tanguay-Renaud, is one of our panelists, is our discussant, and he will speak at the end. So, without further delay, and to introduce your panel this evening, let me hand over to our moderator from Anak Bayan, BAYAN-Canada, Alex Felipe.
Thank you.
So this is, are you going to come up here?
I can sit down, yeah. Thanks. All right. Let me set my timer so I don't go over time. So thank you, first of all, to the York Center for Asian Research for putting together this event, and thank you all for coming. I hope that we'll have a very interesting discussion today, and I really hope people will take part in the question and answer period at the end, because that really, I think, is where we'll be able to flesh out some more of these issues. So I was asked to begin with a brief background on martial law and Marcos, for those that aren't too familiar with it as yet. So Ferdinand Marcos, he first became president with a nationalist message in 1965. He retained that position in the following election in 1969, and at the time, presidents only had a 2-year limit, so that should have been his last term. Interestingly, 1969 is also the year the New People's Army was born. So this continued the tradition of previous revolutionary movements. In this case, this strain started with the Hukbalahap, which was the fight against the Japanese in World War II. The progressive movement at the time, in 1969, 1970, was really picking up a lot of steam. Discontent with government corruption, the pro-foreign domestic and foreign policy in the country was part of everyday social milieu. In 1970, the student protests reached their height during the so-called first quarter storm. This is when demonstrations and strikes erupted all across the country. This basically spurred on the call for martial law. So martial law was declared on the 21st of September, 1972. And Marcos, at that time, his rationale was to stem the threat of communism and the destabilization by oligarchs, and this is his rationale for declaring it in 1972. So this year would have been its 40th anniversary. Also in 1972, a constitutional convention was called, and this is when the constitution was changed in the Philippines. And this allowed Marcos to become both the president and prime minister, and term limits were abolished. And this is why he was able to stay in power until 1986. So martial law, basically, to describe it in a very simple way, and I'm sure some of the other speakers will go more into it, put an end to habeas corpus, due process in the law, and final authority rested with the executive branch. Freedom of speech, of assembly, and human rights were curtailed, and curfews were established in the cities. Now, for a lot of us here, this is before our time, for the students and for myself. And for me personally, I only knew martial law as this vague background that I heard from my parents as to why the Philippines was corrupt and why our family had to migrate to Canada. My only real memories of it as a child were my dad calling me on the phone after school to tell me to tape it on the Betamax when Noynoy was assassinated in '83. And then again when People Power happened in 1986, the protest that led to Marcos's ouster. So I think it's fair some of us asked, because I know I did, why should I care? I think the quick answer to this is because the struggles that began in that time still haven't been resolved. And these struggles, in fact, began long before martial law, and they still continue to this day. So one example of this is in human rights statistics. So during Marcos's 20-year rule, about 1,500 people were killed extrajudicially, basically means death squads. About 759 people involuntarily disappeared, and there were about 35,000 people that were tortured. As a comparison, from 2001 to today, approximately 1,300 extrajudicial killings have happened in the Philippines. So it's almost the same as the 20-year period of Marcos. Over 200 people have disappeared, and torture victims are over 1,000 as well. And there's still, I'm sure they'll get to it in terms of political prisoners, was it 200 something that are still, well, someone will get into that after. So these are some examples of why the struggle still is continuing to this day, and it's just the tip of the iceberg. The Philippine economy, despite what you might have heard from the GDP statistics that seem to be quite divorced from reality, continues to worsen, as there is no national industrialization policy still in the Philippines, and the preferred investment strategy still is foreign investment and foreign ownership of Philippine areas. So, Ms. Bern Laguna, who's sitting next to me here, will talk a little bit about this in relation to mining, Canadian mining as well, and militarization in the Philippines. Moreover, as the country falls deeper and deeper into poverty, the government becomes more and more reliant on its #1 export, which continues to be people. At present, about 4,000 people leave the Philippines, more than 4,000 people leave the Philippines every day to look for work abroad. And Filipinos are basically, right now here in Canada, to bring it back here, we're now the #1 source of migrants here in Canada. And I say migrants and not immigrants because a lot of those are coming in as temporary workers, and temporary workers don't have the ability, well, a certain kind of temporary workers don't have the ability to become eligible for citizenship. So another recent example that we've heard of, at least in Philippine circles, is the issue of the cybercrime law, also known colloquially as the e-martial law, which basically threatened to imprison people for criticizing the government online. This is just recently, just a little while ago. So even, for example, casual activism on Facebook was made illegal. So if you liked something on Facebook or if you shared something on Facebook that was contrary, that spoke ill of the government, you were liable for up to 12 years imprisonment. This recently got, because of the activism that's been happening in the Philippines and abroad, there's been a 120-day, what's the word for it? It's been put on hiatus for 120 days while they reassess. So it's an example of what we can do if we actually get together. And I want to speak directly to Canadians that are wondering, why should Canadians care? And I think I think the important part of this is to really remember what kind of Canada we want, right? We want the Canada of Canadian mythology, the one that's a peacekeeper, the one that's a defender of human rights. But the Canada we get's a little bit less benign. And as we'll hear today, we'll see how Canada has its hands in the Philippines as well. And for Filipinos in the room, I think it's also really important for us to think about why we should care about this as well, because some of us might be thinking we've now escaped from all this. And I want to really press that we haven't. And and we just have to look around to see what the reality is. Most Filipinos work bottom ladder jobs, and even for the second generation, things aren't much improving. As current research shows, we have very high dropout rates, and we're the only immigrants where in the second generation we make less income than the first, which is a really stunning statistic. And more than this, I think something we've all seen, especially those of us that grew up here, is the lack of pride and low levels of self-esteem that a lot of Filipinos have. And I think if we're really honest, we have to admit that a lot of this stems from the fact that the home country continues to suffer, despite the fact that there's natural riches there. And because our sisters and brothers around the world continue to be marketed as cheap, skilled export workers. So on the surface, it's very difficult, I think, for Filipinos to have pride when economic and political reality tells us that our country and our people are simply there for the convenience of others. So to end, let me end with some optimism. I do think that there's very good reason to be proud as a Filipino. But for me, pride can't just be stated as fact. It's not just wearing a t-shirt. It's not just waving a flag. Pride has to be earned, and you can only earn pride through action. And so my pride and our pride, I think, is earned by the thousands and thousands that struggled and continue to struggle for something better. That despite the odds and very real threats to their lives and their livelihoods, they continue to fight back. And I think we're going to hear from some of those people today. And I really hope that this inspires all of us here, Filipinos, Canadians, and Filipino Canadians, to take interest and to join in that struggle. So, with that, let me introduce our guests. So, as you can see as everyone has this sheet, our first speaker is going to be Mr. Perry Sorio. He's a former political prisoner and the current Secretary General of Migrante Canada. Following will be Ricky Esguerra, who's also a former political prisoner, and he is with the Philippine Solidarity Network and the Vice Chair for Education of the Community Alliance for Social Justice in Toronto. Third will be Ms. Bern Jagunos, who is the Asia Program Coordinator of the United Church of Canada. And finally, as our discussant, we're going to have Mr. François Tanguay-Renaud, I hope I said that right, who is the Associate Professor of the Osgoode Hall Law School, Director of the Nathanson Center on Transnational Human Rights, Crime and Security at York University. And then following this, we'll have our question and answer period. And again, the podium is over there. Please ask your question at the podium so we can get the audio to the cameras. So thank you very much, and let me introduce our first speaker, Mr. Perry Sorio.
Good evening. During martial law, this very gathering is illegal. This very gathering would be, I'd say, the cameras that you see here would be the cameras of the intelligence services of the armed forces of the Philippines. Anytime you see a camera, flashing pictures like that, would be the intelligence services again. And outside of this room would be men in walkie-talkies talking, monitoring the movements of students. That's the atmosphere of martial law. The main features of any martial law regime, whether you are in Philippines, Guatemala, El Salvador, or Nicaragua, would be, of course, political prisoners, detention. I was a second-year first-year student when martial law was declared, and by the time I became a university student, I became a political prisoner as well. Attending gatherings like this enlightened my mind on the real state of the country, that the country that Marcos was saying was the smiling martial law wasn't really smiling after all. There was this big brother always watching us. I learned became politicized because of the student P issue. I complained and joined the boycott movement to raise concern about the rising tuition fees of students in my university, the lack of a student council, there's no academic freedom. We have a controlled campus paper. And eventually I learned that my struggle as a student was not different from the struggle of the peasantry, of the workers, of the different classes in the Philippines. And because of that, I had to leave school and be part of a movement for national liberation of the Philippines. In the process of that participation, I got arrested. And it was published by the Philippine Reporter last year. A lot of my friends, when I came here, have always known that, he was a political prisoner. He got tortured. He got tortured and electrocuted in his genital. Simple as that. And last year, when I was asked by the group of the youth, Anakbayan, Alex group, to recount my torture, he made a very striking comment that really struck me when he said, I heard so much about your torture, but you've never really discussed it in length, that how it is, the shock. But I didn't realize that I had to recount it several times now. And why am I recounting? It's something I'm going to tell you later on. In April of 1980s, April 21, I think, 1981, I was arrested, suspected as member of National Democratic Front, and tortured by the military group it's called the PIP, Military Intelligence Group, Intelligence Services, Armed Forces of the Philippines. We were detained in a special camp. It's called the Safe House. There's 5 of us. Eventually, we became 12. And that detention is what the military and the International Red Cross considered a 5-star hotel compared to other detention centers, because we were getting like $9 a day in lunch, in meal allowance, compared to like 6 pesos a day in other detention centers. But before that detention, when you get arrested, you undergo what's called the tactical intelligence interrogation. And what was done to me is I was in a room like similar to this, sitting in a center. You always ask questions. I was stripped naked. My hands was tied in the chair. And I was given what they call the electric shock treatment. Basically, what happened was they used the 2 end poles, wire poles of the military field radio, and tied it around my genital. And for an hour, I was being tortured. They use there's a crank in that radio that delivers the electric current to your genital, or for a woman it would be on their nipple. And as to the process, they would pour water over me. And at a certain point, I was like, I can scream. And the screaming eventually releases the pressure. And I was like, I wish I would just die. I wish it would be over. They ask you questions. I look at pictures. Who's this? Who's this? Where's your underground house? Who is your collective? Who's your leader? Things like that were being asked. And as I screamed, one soldier grabbed my underwear and stuck it in my mouth. And Alex always loved this description of my yellow striped underwear that I always tell him. When I was there being tortured, I said to myself, if I die with this yellow underwear, it's an ugly picture in a newspaper. So I told myself I'll never wear that kind of underwear again. So anyway, and I really made that promise. But it was a nightmare. The torture was a nightmare. And I thought it would be over, After the hour of questioning, it was taken up, and for several. And then as the days in detention happens, I would see my torturers. And there's more specific details of this in my article here in Philippine Reporter. But every time I see them, I would hide in my cell because I was so scared. I thought they would come, take me, and torture me again. But one day I said I had enough. So I took courage and went out of my detention cell and offered them a cup of coffee. I asked them to have breakfast with me because I was in charge of the kitchen. And actually, that was striking for them that the colonel asked me, are you planning something against us? Because you have been treating my men nicely, and they're questioning it because we tortured you. And I said it was war. And in war, things like this happen. And I, through the years when Marcos fell, the government of Marcos fell, I was part of the group, Ricky was part of the group, who pushed for the class action suit against Marcos. We pursue justice on martial law victims, and we have to go to Hawaii because the Philippine government itself would not give us justice. So we won that case, the class action suit, and luckily, after several years, I got my $1,000 last year, right? So that was the price of my electrocution of my genital. Ricky spent 2 years in prison, but he was disqualified from receiving this compensation money. And at present, there is a law that needs to be signed by the president. That's called the Marcos Victim Compensation Bill. And that's supposed to compensate the victims of martial law. I took my $1,000 and never cashed it because I said to myself and to my friends, this $1,000 check is a clear proof that we indeed are victims of martial law and there was violations of human rights during the time of Marcos. That cannot be taken away for us. That is the price of $1,000 that I value more than the $1,000. The Marcos government or any other governments cannot say there was no human rights violations in the Philippines. And it is sad that lately I've read about and really talking about, the beauty and the benefits of martial law and how there were no human rights victims. And when I read that, I went back and looked at my box where I kept that check and said, this is it. That's why I don't want to cash this. Because for as long as I live, and as long as there are human rights violations, this is a clear proof that your breaking $1,000 is indeed a manifestation of there were thousands of people whose rights were violated by the martial law regime. And I said to myself, why do I still talk about martial law after 40 years? Well, it is sad because the same story that I'm saying to you right now, I'm telling everyone today, is the same story that is happening to more than 300 political prisoners in the Philippines. Today, more than 100 of them have been arrested under the term of this present president, Noynoy Aquino. When Noynoy Aquino became president, I asked for one message of peace and reconciliation. Just like his mother, I requested that he free all political prisoners and grant amnesty to all of them. But indeed, what did I find? More than 100 of them were arrested. And there's 112 victims right now of impunities, killed, abducted during the period of Noynoy Aquino. Now, what does this got to do with Canada? When I was a political prisoner, the people in this room, like what's happening here, they conducted petition campaigns, more education discussions. The churches of Canada adopted me as a political prisoner, and they were sending me letters. And I'm just telling all of you here today that your presence is valuable. Please write letters to the President of the Philippines and say, we ask you, we have heard that there are more than 300 political prisoners in the Philippines. We ask that you grant amnesty and freedom to all of them. Those letters mean a lot. Don't take that for granted. You can even tweet about it now, and you can even put it on Facebook. You have 130 days while the temporary restraining order is in place, so that you can take advantage of that e-crime bill. Take advantage of that. Like right now, if you show it, please show it right away, so that I'm still covered with the e-libel bill of the Philippines, right? Because after that, anything like this is considered a crime in the Philippines. So our freedom of speech is now being curtailed even overseas. And that's why I was wondering, after 40 years, is this the new form of martial law in the Philippines? Thank you very much, everybody.
So following, we have Mr. Ricky Esguerra, who is again a former political prisoner. Also works with the Philippine Solidarity Network, is the vice chair for education of the Community Alliance for Social Justice here in Toronto. So let's welcome Mr. Ricky Esguerra.
Good evening, magandang gabi po sa inyong lahat. It's always hard to tell these stories, no? And to go back to such experiences that we had before. Anyway, my activism came as a result of my Christian upbringing. Since high school, I was already involved in student Catholic action. When I went to college, I got involved in the Ateneo Catechetical Instruction League and also the Student Catholic Action. When I went to graduate school, I was still involved in Student Catholic Action work through the Archdiocese of Manila, but then doing work among the urban poor in the along the railroad tracks in for those of you who know Pandacan, the area in Malate, San Andres, no, and in the areas of Tondo, no, the Tondo foreshore land. No. So my idealism was really at a high there, no? And I was always so excited and looking forward to visiting urban poor areas, urban poor communities, no? Trying to do catechism work among the squatters, no? The so-called squatters. No? So when martial law was declared, or even before martial law was declared, I was already an activist in the school. I was already an activist at the Ateneo de Manila University, a Jesuit-run university. And I must say it was the Jesuits who first taught me Marxism and the analysis of society, the idea of class struggle, the idea of people, the idea of alienation, and the idea of people struggling to overcome this alienation and liberate themselves. No? So when martial law was declared, I was a third year student at the Ateneo de Manila. And on the morning that we heard that martial law had been declared, immediately me and my friends left our homes to discuss what we were going to do. Were we going to be able to go back to school? Or were we already, how do we call that? Were we already blacklisted? Or if we went to school, would we be brought to prison? In short, they were allowing people to go to school, but we were considered under observation because they knew our records. So we went to school, but we produced leaflets. We produced leaflets about the evils of martial law. We produced leaflets about the restoration of democracy, or fighting for the restoration of democracy. Of course, we couldn't do that in the same way that some of you here received leaflets in the malls about this event, no? Or saw posters in the school, no? Or saw photo exhibits about the situation. We had to do this underground. But one day, as we were going out of the school, we were stopped by security. And unfortunately, there were some more leaflets left in our bag. So we were taken to the military camp. They turned us over to the military camp. And that was in 1973. Martial law was declared September 72. That was March 1973 when we were arrested at the gates of the Ateneo. That was 2 weeks before my graduation. We were brought to the military camp, but fortunately, the military unit that arrested us, see in the Ateneo, it was the Air Force. So the Air Force didn't know anything about the anti-subversion law, didn't know anything about subversion. So they beat us up because they wanted to know if we were smoking pot. Because their idea of activists is youth who are potheads, no? Or crackheads. No? And to make a long story short, after 3 days, we were released. No? So I was able to graduate, but the dean of the Ateneo then was the father confessor of Mr. Marcos. What was his name? Father Jose Cruz. So he was surprised that I was there, and he was really mad because this is the first case, no, in the Ateneo that activists were arrested for protesting against the Marcos regime. So that was the first time. But see, then I am what they call a recidivist. I was so hard-headed that I didn't learn from this lesson. I went back to my organizing ways. As I said, I went to graduate school, but this time through the Archdiocese of Manila, I was doing organizing work among the urban poor of Tondo, Malate, Pandacan. And a week after the New Year of 1976, as we went to visit our friend's house, there were other people there in that house. And when I entered that house, I knew that something was going on. And they immediately grabbed me. They started hitting me on the chest, on the head, and they stripped me naked and were forcing me to dance in front of the old housemaid in that house. No? And I learned my first lesson there in front of torture. No? See, the object of torture is to not so much to extract information, but to humiliate and to destroy, no? To destroy your will. And then later, maybe they would come out with information or not. My first lesson was, you should not let yourself fall to the ground, whatever they do. Because when I fell to the floor, I received the most powerful kicks on my ribs, on my head, and I tasted the heels of the boots of my captors. And then they bound me to a chair with, I don't know if you've seen finger cuffs. No? Not, we know handcuffs, no? But there was finger cuffs, no? With teeth in them, so that if you move your finger, the cuff tightens. And I was sitting on a captain's chair with my hands suspended like that. So when I fell asleep and I woke up, my fingers were all bleeding. No? And then came the morning, there was a call. They said, somebody said probably they are bringing me somewhere, and I thought that was the end of it. But then one of the intelligence agents whispered in my ear, dedo ka na. You're dead. No? Because this is the first time that I learned another meaning for the word salvage. Salvage, which is supposed to mean preserve, to save. No? Salvage in military parlance means summary execution. No? So I was so scared that they were going to bring me somewhere and execute me that morning. They blindfolded me and put me in a military Toyota Cruiser. And finally, when we arrived at the destination, it looked like it was a house. I couldn't see, I was blindfolded. And once the blindfold was taken away, somebody shoved orange peel in place of the cloth that was blindfolded on me. You know the fruit Chico? No? The peel, no? Yung skin ng Chico, they put it in my eyes, no? in place of the blindfolds. No? And then they started punching and kicking me again. I remember this agent who had I thought he had the biggest hands. He had the biggest fists that he shoved into my chest, which awakens you. No? You're scared when there's nothing, no? But when they hit you, then you wake up. So so you come to your senses, no? And so the beatings continued, no? And what they used the angular bar. If you know a steel cut, the military steel cut, they have the foot of that cut, and they use the angular bar to hit you on the shins, no? Slowly, but the pain shoots up to your head. No? And then after that, when they probably had done enough, they put me in the washroom, handcuffed me under the faucet, and made me a human toilet. And I was there for 3 days. And I learned later, when I was already in Canada, I met one of my friends who was also an ex-detainee. and we were telling stories about our torture experience. And he said that one day in a safe house, he was blindfolded and he had to pee. And he was brought to this washroom where he was peeing all over someone who was there, handcuffed under that faucet. That was me. So we were laughing at this. We were laughing at this experience that we had already known each other then in that military safe house. Okay, so I stopped there with my personal experience. But then, see, at that time, who was the commanding officer of the unit that arrested us? The unit that arrested us was the dreaded Constabulary Security Unit, the 5th Constabulary Security Unit. Some of our friends here who also suffered at the hands of those military men. The commanding officer was Lieutenant Rodolfo Aguinaldo. Now, Rodolfo Aguinaldo, if you watched Apocalypse Now, he was someone like Colonel Kreutz. He would go around with this bandolier, and around the camp he would even have his little monkey with him, and he would play good guy and bad guy at the same time. He would take away my cuffs and he would give me cold water, and then when he woke up, he would beat me up and say, "Why did you take off your cuffs?" when he was the first one, when he was the one who took it off. So what happened to Lieutenant Aguinaldo? Lieutenant Aguinaldo eventually became captain, major, and also became general, if I'm not mistaken. Eventually, he also became congressman, and then he became governor of his province in Cagayan. I tell this story to show that things have not really changed. Because today, we have another Rodolfo Aguinaldo in the person of Jovito Palparan. Jovito Palparan is known as the butcher of what first? Samar, and then Central Luzon, Mindoro, wherever he went during the time of Mrs. Macapagal Arroyo, there was extrajudicial killings. There was a spate of extrajudicial killings. But then, of course, this is not Palparan's idea alone. And this is part of a whole scheme of operation plans designed to neutralize, to contain, to neutralize, to eliminate the people's resistance. And for what interests? For what interests? It has been documented by Karapatan, by church groups in the Philippines, that militarization is especially heavy in areas where there are foreign corporate interests. Today, there are a whole lot of mining interests or mining explorations, or mining operations going on in different parts of the country, from the north in the Cordillera to down south in Mindanao. Aside from mining operations, there are also mega projects, hydroelectric projects, and there are palm oil plantations as well. Plantations for export. And with this, I remember during the time of martial law, most of you will remember the Chico River Dam struggle, the struggle of the Bontoc and Kalinga people against the World Bank IMF-funded Chico River Dam that was going to destroy hundreds of villages and affect the lives of thousands of indigenous peoples in that area of the Cordillera. The leader then was Macleing Dulag. He was assassinated by the military in April of 1984. Today, how many indigenous peoples leaders have been assassinated? Just recently, we had this piece of news last week from the rural missionaries of the Philippines. At around 3 p.m. on October 3, Gilbert Baburada, 47 years of age, chairman of Pangalasag, or Indigenous Shield, was about to alight from a public tricycle when he was shot by two motorcycle riding men. This is the trademark of these assassins, no? According to initial data gathered by the rural missionaries of the Philippines in northern Mindanao. Witnesses said one of the men moved closer to Pabarada and fired at him again in the head. He sustained 5 gunshot wounds, 2 on his chest, 1 on the abdominal area, another on his hand. He was dead on the spot. We believe that Pabarada was killed because of his stance against A. Brown Company's palm oil plantation, which is a U.S. corporation. This was the statement of the Regional Organization of Indigenous Peoples in Northern Mindanao. Earlier, when was this? Last year, a priest, an Italian priest, Father Pops Tentorio, was also assassinated in the same manner. Father Tentorio was a close friend of the Lumads, indigenous peoples in Mindanao. He helped them in handling their human rights concerns. He helped them on rights and welfare issues. This is happening today. What happened in the past? In 1975, the Latondenya strike, workers' strike, was the first mass action to break the terror effect of martial law. And the Latondenya strike was supported by the Association of Major Religious Superiors, by the church in the Philippines. And what did Marcos do? Marcos issued Presidential Decree 823, which banned the participation and would penalize foreign missionaries. So I'm saying this just to show what is the difference. Is there any difference at all? Thank you.
So thank you to Tito Ricky. Before we move on, I'd like to extend our warm welcome to Consul General Junever Mahilum West, who's in attendance. She just came in, so let's welcome her. Thank you for coming. So let's move on to our third speaker. Our third speaker is Ms. Bern Jagunos, who is the Asia Program Coordinator for the United Church of Canada. Let's welcome Ms. Bern Jagunos.
Thank you. Good afternoon. As Ricky and as Alex has mentioned and demonstrated, martial law was lifted when the former dictator, Ferdinand Marcos, was ousted from power, and the new president, Cory Aquino, who is the mother of the present president, came into power. But as they demonstrated also, the features, the conditions, and the situation of martial law and the stories of martial law have not stopped. As Alex had said, at least since 2001, the conditions similar to martial law or continuing from martial law the virtual martial law happening in the Philippines resulted to the assassination of more than 1,000, almost 2,000 now, of Filipino civilians, not rebels, Filipino civilians. The political assassination, the imprisonment of more than 300 people. 100 plus of them have been arrested in this present administration. Is it now two years? Going.
2010.
2010. In the last 2 years have been arrested, and they are languishing in prison right now. And I don't have the figure of those who have been abducted and are still missing to the present time. And who are the victims? The victims are political activists, students. The goal was to eliminate the insurgency movement within 10 years. So that was in 2001. What are the features? And according to Philip Alston, there are 2 features of this counterinsurgency launched by then President Arroyo. That is the cause of the extrajudicial killings and the human rights violation. The first feature of this counterinsurgency war is one. Unlike the past counterinsurgency war, the new insurgency war called Operation Plan Bantaylaya or Freedom Watch targets not only the armed rebels, but organizations and individuals who are deemed by the government as part of the political structure of the rebel movement. And those that they said are the political structures of the rebel movement include, of course, the opposition, some progressive opposition parties, movements of political activists, student movements, environmentalists, even church. The second feature of that counterinsurgency war is the vilification of these individuals and organizations who are said to be members or part of the political structures of the rebel movement. These organizations and individuals are labeled as enemies of the state, a code word that meant that these organizations and individuals are made or have become targets of the counterinsurgency war. Documents from the military with a list of enemies of the state, the so-called enemies of the state, that were leaked out, but also actually presented publicly by the military and the government agencies, included among these enemies of the state, human rights organizations, progressive opposition parties, farmers' organizations, labor unions, and even churches, including some of our partners, United Church partners in the Philippines, United Church of Christ in the Philippines, the National Council of Churches in the Philippines. And so in that logic, members of this organization become targets of the counterinsurgency war. The other thing in this vilification and this counterinsurgency war is that it calls for the neutralization of these enemies of the state, which is actually a code word of they can be eliminated by various means, arrest, abduction, or even by killings. And so you can see the phenomenon of political assassination, extrajudicial killings. Most of the political killings or arrest and detention are preceded by the labeling of the persons who become victims as members of the rebel movement or enemies of the state by the military. There has been a change of government in 2010. We now have, or the Philippines now have, a new government under President Aquino. But that counterinsurgency war of the past government has been continued by the new government under a new name called Operation Plan Bayanihan. Bayanihan is community helping together. So that counterinsurgency plan war has continued. What is the link to Canada? As I said, that's over there. What's the link to Canada? There are two that I can name. As I said, this counterinsurgency gave the reason, gave the justification to the past government to launch an all-out counterinsurgency war. The Canadian government, a key objective, one of the key objectives of Canadian foreign policy and Canadian foreign relations is the fight against terrorism. Canada is a member of that Western coalition of states that are fighting against terrorism, that are sponsors and part of the war on terror. In the policy document of the Canadian of Foreign Affairs, there are two features around this. It says, in Canada-Philippine relations, one of the activities is close cooperation between Canada and the Philippines to build partnership and enhance training to advance security sectors reforms. It also mentions that among the exports, economic activity between Canada and the Philippines is Canada's transfer or export of defense, aerospace, are areas for investments of Canada. We have been trying to ask about what is the Canadian-Philippine cooperation on security. We have not received a clear answer from the Canadian government. The other link between Canada and the Philippines is around the mining sector and extractive industries. Mining sector, mining development is a key sector for development in the Philippines. And mining investment is also a key investment of Canada in the Philippines. It is identified. The Operation Bantaylaya, the counterinsurgency, one of the objectives of the counterinsurgency is also to create a peaceful environment for economic development, to create a peaceful and a situation of peace and order for foreign investors, which means the elimination of the rebel movement, the neutralization of the rebel movement, the elimination of opposition to economic projects, including the mining sector. There are a large number of Canadian mining corporations that are involved in mining activities, mining operation and exploration in the Philippines. Almost all of the mining activities in the Philippines are preceded or accompanied by militarization under the guise of counterinsurgency war, including the areas where Canadian corporations are operating. So in that context of militarization, human rights violations occur, extrajudicial killings occur. The counterinsurgency war is used in favor of including the activities of Canadian corporations. The United Church and civil human rights organization in the Philippines and the Filipino community have since 2001 have been doing advocacy work in Canada because of this link between Canada and the Philippines. The response of the Canadian government to what's happening in the Philippines has been silence. There has only been one public statement by the Canadian government about what is happening in the Philippines. One statement condemning the killings in the Philippines and calling for the prosecution of those responsible. And it was not from Canada, in fact. The statement was made by the Embassy of Canada in the Philippines. Pressed for action, the Canadian government's response has been always, we don't do public statements, which we heard actually in Congo, you know, the Prime Minister of Canada talking about human rights in Congo, right? But they have been always telling us, we don't do public condemnation of human rights in the Philippines. We do quiet advocacy. They have been also providing training, human rights training, to the Philippine military and police, and support for the judicial reforms in the Philippines. Why do you think, I mean, we try to find out what is the reason for Canada's inaction, Canada's silence about what's happening in the Philippines. We believe that, and in its statement, Canada believes that the Philippines is still the most vibrant democracy in Southeast Asia, despite the fact that journalists are killed, that human rights defenders are killed. Canada still believes that the Philippines is a democracy. We also believe that Canada is silent because of its economic interest and mining interest in the Philippines, and because of its war on terror or agenda against terrorism. So what are our calls for advocacy? One, public denunciation, public statements about what's happening in the Philippines, particularly the extrajudicial killings, a review of Canada-Philippine relations, and specifically to ensure that none of Canada's assistance, none of Canada's involvement has to do or promotes and supports the counterinsurgency war. And third, we have been calling on Canada to condition its relations, to condition its support for the Philippine government on actions to eliminate the human rights violations, to withdraw the counterinsurgency war, which is the cause of these human rights violations. There has been a network formed in Canada called Stop the Killings Network in the Philippines, and we have been doing advocacy work. And what we have been doing, letter writing, petition to the parliament. In 2007, we had 13 parliamentarians who filed petitions at the House of Commons from all 4 parties. We have human rights delegations from the Philippines, including churches, human rights defenders, but also parliamentarians. And then we had 2 hearings at the House of Commons Subcommittee on International Human Rights. Coming up, we have plans for new actions. One is we are trying to press for a Canadian parliamentary fact-finding mission to the Philippines. We have been in dialogue with parliamentarians about this, sending parliamentarians to the Philippines to look into the human rights situation in the Philippines. There is an upcoming petition to the Canadian government that we are preparing, and this will be focused on mining and human rights, specifically calling for regulation of mining companies, a pressure to end the counterinsurgency war, particularly the vilification of environmentalists and those who oppose the mining activities, and the withdrawal of support for companies who employ militias and government security forces in their mining areas. And then we also have a political and campaign. Perry mentioned about a campaign to free all political prisoners who are currently in the Philippines, jailed in the Philippines right now. If you wish, please sign a petition. We have some petitions here. This is, as I said, the photo of the recent killing in the Philippine and Aboriginal people. They are calling for you to support, for us to support these posters that will go around globally, calling for an end to land grabbing, to assault in indigenous peoples' lands that cause the human rights violations of indigenous peoples. Thank you.
Before we move on to our final speaker, the discussant, I wanted to actually give you a couple more stats that Tita Bern wasn't able to tell at that time. So I'm just going to add a little bit to what she mentioned. She mentioned the private militias. You may already know that since November of last year, the Philippine government has made it legal for mining companies to have their own private militias now in the Philippines. Mining in the Philippines, upwards of about 30% of the Philippines' landmass has been signed over to mining exploration as of this date. 66% of the Cordillera, the mountainous region in the north. And as for the link between Canada's military and the Philippines, when Bishop Ruel Marigsa, one of the human rights defenders that was here earlier this year, came in, he had this really interesting quote that I want to share with you. So he mentions that Canada does some human rights training with the Philippine Army, and he mentioned that the Amnesty International did a report based on the Armed Forces of the Philippines Manual on Human Rights, and here's a quote that they found within it. So, quote, "It is imperative that the soldiers are conversant with human rights standards in order to survive the ordeals of investigation in cases where he becomes involved in a human rights violation." Now, it should be obvious the problem with this. It's not don't do human rights. It's if you do human rights, make sure you do this so you don't get caught. So just a few things to add to that. And let me move on to our final panelist, our discussant, Mr. François Tanguay-Renaud. Tanguay, I'm sorry.
Tanguay, that's good.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good evening. Magandang gabi po. It's a great pleasure for me to be here tonight, even though it's very hard to follow up testimonies like the ones we've just heard. I mean, what horrific stories of the past and of the present. It's very nice for me to be here tonight. Well, of course, because I direct the Nathanson Center on Transnational Human Rights, Crime, and Security. So this topic fits right in our mandate. Martial law is also something that I studied for some time and focused on during my graduate studies. So it's a topic which is quote unquote dear to my heart. And but that's not the main reason why I'm happy to be here tonight. The main reason is that I've been associated for some time with the Filipino community, as I was a bright, engaged university student at McGill many years ago, wanting to make a difference. I started volunteering with the Immigrant Worker Center in Montreal, which happened to be run by Filipinos. And the more I volunteered with the Immigrant Worker Center, the more I realized that the Filipino community in Montreal was very well organized, so much so that they were also organizing all the other migrants as well as me. And I learned a lot, so much so that a few years later, when I spent a bit of time in Asia, I got to go to the Philippines. I got very interested in the situation there and why it might be that the communities in Canada were so well organized. And I got to realize what people in the Philippines had gone through and were still going through, which had led them to become organized the way they were, and found that extremely praiseworthy. So what I want to talk about tonight is mostly what I want to say is mostly in the form of a provocation, right? I'm an academic. That's what I do. I provoke. If what we haven't heard is not already provocative enough. We're here, I won't say commemorating, but marking 40 years of martial law in the Philippines. Now, you might ask me, François, what is that martial law? As a law professor, what do you think, what kind of law is that, a martial law? Well, martial, that comes from military, right? We've heard Perry, Ricky, Bern, referred to what was going on in the Philippines and what might still be going on today, but at least at the time, as it was not so much a legal situation, it was war, right? People were getting tortured right front and center, having their genitals electrocuted, them being beaten up by people with gigantic hands. Has to make one think. So what is that martial law? Well, we had martial law in this country, in Canada, in 1970, 2 years before the Philippines, when a very small movement in Quebec called the Quebec Liberation Front, nationalist movement, kidnapped a British diplomat and as well as a minister and plausibly accidentally ended up killing the Quebec minister. And so the Prime Minister at the time of Canada, Pierre-Éliott Trudeau, decided that this was good enough to suspend whatever civil rights were present in the province of Quebec and to send the army, right? To send the army and to arrest, detain a lot of people, aggressively interrogate a number of people. That was my parents' generation. And so one might think, well, that's not the kind of legal regime or a regime or a country ruled by law, what we're used to hearing that's supposed to be, isn't it? It's more, well, that's ruled by the military. And what's ruled by the military? Well, when the military is ruling, it's typically because it's a situation of war, where law does not prevail. Like, war tends to be the antithesis of law. We try to have some rules, the Geneva Conventions that regulate what's happening in war, but typically it's not very successful. So we're talking about two very different things here. At the time in 1970s in Canada, it was called the martial law because it was declared according to the Martial Law Act. Today we have different words to talk about this kind of suspension of civil liberties or of the normal legal order. We call these things emergencies. So in Canada today we don't have a Martial Law Act anymore. We have an Emergencies Act. Now, why would we need to have an Emergencies Act? Well, what's an emergency, right? Well, emergency, we all face emergencies sometimes in our lives, right? You might see somebody on the street who's having a heart attack and they need emergency treatment, otherwise they're gonna die, right? It's a situation where if we don't act immediately, urgently, some great harm is going to happen. Right? And in the life of a state, in the life of a nation, there are emergencies, right? Which might require us to step out of the traditional paths that we think, to organize ourselves, to regulate ourselves. We might have natural disasters, right, which require us to call in the army and to suspend certain rules that are typically in place so that we can attend to the people who are dying, who have been injured by the situation. We might have a situation like an attack, right? Somebody is attacking our country, and we cannot have the typical democratic deliberation where somebody makes a bill in front of the House of Commons and there are 3 readings, and then it has to be adopted by the governor, the Governor General of Canada here in Canada, for him or her to give his assent. So we need to have some means of saying, well, we're going to move differently in order to be able to respond to the situation, because it's justified to do so. It's very important. Otherwise, very big harm is going to result. So emergencies regulation or emergency laws, I'm not saying that they are never required. The danger with that, the danger with this word emergency or this expression martial law, is that it tends to be abused, right? The minute you say we can't suspend normal processes, we can't suspend the Constitution that we have that entrenches rights and liberties. The Filipino Constitution did, at the time of martial law, still purportedly at least guarantee rights and liberties. The Canadian Charter still does at least purport to guarantee rights and liberties. Well, if we say that in an emergency we can suspend this, then what is an emergency, and who is to define what an emergency is, right? The European Convention on Human Rights says, well, okay, there might be emergencies, but we need to regulate what we can do in times of emergency. So the European Convention of Human Rights, one of the first big human rights document with some teeth, because there's a court that adjudicates what happens, what states do in relation to the content of the convention. It says, in times of war or other public emergency threatening the life of the nation, any high contracting party, any state party to the convention, may take measures derogating from its obligation under this convention to the extent strictly required by the exigencies of the situation, provided that such measures are not inconsistent with its other obligations under international law. And it's not that all rights can be suspended, right? The right to life can be suspended. The right not to be tortured cannot be suspended, even under that provision. The right not to be enslaved, or the right not to be arbitrarily detained, that can be suspended. Why? Because of the risk of abuse. So now we don't have martial law anymore in the Philippines. And the question is, well, what do we have? We're back to normality, right? We're not in an emergency anymore, so we're told. We're back to normality. It's not war. It's not officially one of those exceptional situations. It's a situation of legality, where the Constitution of 1987 in the Philippines, which guarantees a bunch of rights, like our Charter of Rights to Filipino people, is in force. Yet, we're not talking about murders. We've heard about extrajudicial killings. We're talking about disappearances. We're not talking about theft. We're talking about corruption, and we all know corruption comes with living in a state like the Philippines. We're not talking about kidnappings. We're talking about preventive detention or arrests without warrant. We're not talking about torture. We're talking about aggressive detention. Right? So why are we not calling what's happening by the words that we're typically using to refer to these kinds of unacceptable behavior? Right? If we were to do it, the state would tell us, well, what we've committed is, we've just committed crimes. We can't do this. We're going to be thrown in jail. We're going to be punished. We're going to be condemned by the state. Thing is, the state itself determines what a crime is. And so obviously, if the state has anything to do with this sort of behavior, well, it's not going to call it a crime. It'll call it what I've just said, these kinds of more polished terms that don't call for the same kind of aversion from us. Who's going to then bring the state to account? You could say, well, there's a court system, right? The Supreme Court of Canada is there to hold the Canadian state to account. So is the Supreme Court of the Philippines. But what if the court doesn't do it? Or the Supreme Court of Canada, for example, doesn't do it all the time, right? Omar Khadr, for example, it said, well, Omar Khadr's rights have been violated, but we can't really do anything about it. We can't force the government to bring him back. Now he's back, thankfully. But so, sometimes the court don't react, don't play the role that they ought to play, qua guarantors of the constitutional framework. So what if the courts don't do it? Well, you could say, well, maybe other countries could hold the state to account. International humanitarian intervention. Well, that doesn't happen very often, and often it's politically motivated, and whenever it's happened, the claim is that a genocide is going on. It's the worst crime imaginable. What about international criminal law, the International Criminal Court? Well, possibly. Crimes against humanity involve conduct such as torture, which is perpetrated in furtherance of a policy enacted by the state. So maybe we're getting somewhere, but, you know, how many prosecutions have there been before the International Criminal Court, and how many have been outside of Africa? Somehow, they're all limited to Africa. Why? I'm asking you the question. So who's going to hold the state to account? Well, maybe other states. Apparently, Canada's not doing its part. Apparently, not many other states are doing their parts. So what are we left with? Well, I just want to leave you with this thought. We've talked a lot about rebellion. We've talked a lot about the people trying to call their states to account. I would like to cite the preamble of the International, or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the quintessential document. In the preamble, it says, whereas it is essential, if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort when there are no other forms of alternatives. So whereas it is essential if men is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, well, it's essential that human rights should be protected by the rule of law. So if the Philippines doesn't want rebellion, then it ought to respect human rights, just like any other state ought to do. Thank you very much.
So thank you, François, and sorry for massacring your name. So we're moving on now to the question and answer period. I also want to remind people that there are food and snacks in the back corner, so feel free to grab some of those. If you have any questions, the podium is right here to my left, your right. Please line up there if you have any questions. And if you want any more information about the work that my group does, there's pamphlets by the exhibit on the side. If you haven't seen that, it's there as well. So let's start with, and let's put the petition up by the desk. Yes? Yeah. Up by the, right in the welcome desk, if anyone's interested. You can grab more. Yeah.
Take this off.
So, any questions? Please ask by the podium because the microphone is for the camera. This is being recorded. The podium is right here to my left, your right. Maybe we can put it in the center, yeah. Oh, great. It's going around.
Good evening, everybody. I will say this in a blunt way. If martial law was not declared in the Philippines, the name of the Philippines would be longer now. Very likely it is People's Republic of the Philippines or People's Democratic Republic of the Philippines. Before martial law, the thoughts and teachings of Mao were rapidly penetrating the Philippines, infiltrating all sectors of the society, education, students and teachers, industry, the labor unions and factory workers, the agriculture, farmers and farm workers, politics, and almost all sectors of society. What is more beastly and heinous than a mother holding one of her child on her breast and the other clinging on her back, hacked, stabbed, mutilated by bolos of the so-called liberation people. Three among the nearly 100 people massacred by the so-called liberation forces.
Does anyone want to take that question?
You have a question?
No, I'd like to continue first.
Okay.
Before martial law, for a politician for him to win in an election,
Will you please get to the question? There are other questions, sir.
is to have guns and guns. Martial law disbanded all these forces, all these political tools. Now, my question is, in every meeting and discussion about martial law, the focus is on the ugly face of martial law. What about the good side of martial law? Because if I will be allowed to continue, I can cite more advantages.
I
and
think we've got the gist of the question,
Okay?
just so we can get more questions from the audience.
Thank you very
sir.
much.
Thank you. Does someone want to take that? And maybe we can move the microphone. Yes.
Okay, I guess my question is almost.
Oh, let's get them to answer the question first, maybe, and then.
Maybe so that a lot of people can ask. Maybe we can get 3 or 4 questions.
Maybe I'd say let's address that first one, and then we can get some more. So let's address that first one as well, because I think it's a really provocative question.
Without martial law? Right, that's a good question. So every time martial law is discussed, there's always the question, it did something good for the country. And it should be justified then. And I think that 40 years of commemorating martial law, I would leave that up to the people to say if it's good or bad for the country. But let me just tell you, if it's good, why was that dictator deposed and taken away from power and found guilty by the Court of Hawaii for violations of human rights in the Philippines? That's my only question. So are you saying it's justified that they tortured and electrocuted my genital?
One of the fundamental rights of peoples is the right to self-determination. You mentioned about if there was no martial law, the name of the Philippines would be Democratic People's Republic of the Philippines. So what's wrong with that? If by the people choose a system of economy, a system of politics, a system of governance that they believed, truly believed, and they truly choose because it promotes and their rights, and it promotes their welfare. I'm not saying what you're talking about is communist is good. What I'm saying is the fundamental right of peoples to choose their future, to choose their lives. Canada has the right to choose it. The Philippines has the right to choose it. I don't want to debate, but I just want to answer. Okay, because sometimes in many countries, a lot of other countries, so-called democracies, said this country is evil because it chooses a particular system of economy, particular system of politics, of government, which is not the same as ours.
All right, I think before we move on, the Consul General wants to make comments, so in deference, we'll let you go first.
Thank you. Am I limited to 2 minutes? Everybody, okay. I'll keep this short. I always welcome dialogues like this, and I was looking forward to joining you in this colloquium, and I thank the York University for the invitation. And when I entered the room, sorry I was late. It's a bit difficult to find this place and with all the rerouting and everything. When I entered the room, I didn't know whether I was back in Geneva when I was assigned when Special Rapporteur Alston was making his report, or I was back in the University of the Philippines during my student days. But as I've said, I always welcome this dialogue because it reminds us how long the road still is to travel when it comes to human rights in the Philippines. You know, but I cannot help but comment, though, that perhaps we should not paint the Philippines in such a very somber brush, because the other side of the coin, of course, is, like any other countries, the Philippines is struggling to promote human rights in the country. When I entered the room, the question was asked, is there a change now, or is there much difference compared to the martial law years? And my answer, my honest answer, from what I have observed so far, is that yes, of course, there is a sea change. Because during the time of martial law, the state and agents of the state had the deliberate policy of, even violating human rights in order to further their ends. But right now, the Philippines has signed all the core human rights conventions. You don't do that just to look good. I mean, you have the Universal Periodic Review, and the Philippines has undergone that twice. You don't sign conventions and then not implement them. The Philippines, in its own way, is trying very hard to comply with all its obligations in these conventions. We don't have much resources, but right after martial law, and then the Cory Aquino government was installed, and now we have her son, Noynoy Aquino, as president. I don't think that there would be a reverse to what happened before. For example, our Constitution, 1987 Constitution, was especially created to make sure that martial law and dictatorship won't happen again. And then I cannot imagine the present president turning his back on human rights when his family was the victim of human rights violations during martial law. So let's be patient with the Philippines and support whatever its efforts are. Because right now, it's not anymore deliberate state policy of violating human rights, but human rights education and training, institution building, capacity building, judicial reforms, and policy reforms. And we even have human rights officers in the military and the police. Some might say they're just, window dressing. But these actions are serious, and we should take them as honest efforts to really put human rights in the mainstream of policy making. So let us not look at the dark side, because we have to move forward. And right now, I believe the Philippines is still one of the most vibrant democracies in Asia. Our civil society, our opposition, they are very, very vocal and still remain free to speak their minds. So that's all I'm going to say. Thank you.
So thank you, Conjen, for your comments. It's much appreciated. Let's take 3 questions. I'm going to give it back to this guy who I took the microphone from first, and then I'll come to you. And then if anyone decides to leave early, we're going to go till about 9:10. Please make sure you remember to sign up by the door there. There's a petition there, and there's also a sign-up sheet for, what was the other one for? It's for YCAR, yes?
Yeah, just so we know. It's 8:10, not 9:10.
Oh, sorry, not 8:10, 8:10. Sorry, brain shut off.
Yeah.
Oh, we can go till 9:10 too. Sorry. We'll take 3 questions.
Thank you. I guess my question is a pretty straightforward and simple one, which is, given the problems with the 2 main insurgent groups and the government seeming, how should I put it, their very clear intention to wipe them out. Why haven't they done so? Either through brute military force or by simply addressing the problems that are causing the insurgents, to become insurgents in the first place. Why haven't them? I mean, what's the action here?
My question sort of relates to that question. I remember taking a group of indigenous people from Taiwan to the Cordillera in 1986, and they were so excited because they saw people organizing themselves for power in the Cordillera People's Alliance, and there was talk about an autonomous region, and we were so impressed with what was happened in the Philippines, because in 1986 Taiwan was still under martial law. They saw Philippines as a great sign of hope. Well, in 30 years, or almost 30 years since then, things have gone on in Taiwan, and both in terms of political development and economic development, and yet the Philippines just seems to keep, it never seems to change. Although many of the tactics and ideas of organizing people for power were developed in the Philippines that are used around the world now, and things like the urban rural mission training, somehow all that organizing doesn't seem to bring people's power. And on the other hand, the Philippines government and the American government and all these counterinsurgency things, and the purges in the NPA in the mid-1990s, where they basically killed off half of themselves and split, yet nothing seems to change. And why? What is the fundamental problem here?
Hi, my name is Ina Pangilinan. I have a question regarding the divide and conquer strategy that you referenced earlier. And the main institutions and entities in the Philippines that I've observed here in this discussion regarding the struggle against human rights violations are the church, academia, the media perhaps, the grassroots organizations, and the government. Given the divide and conquer strategy that has been used in the past and perhaps even today, what has the role of unification played amongst these main institutions and entities present in the discourse of human rights? I hear so often from time to time that Filipinos aren't united, whether it's in language, culture, whether geographically. So what can be done to address the need for unification in this discourse of human rights?
Thank you. So let's take the three, and then we'll take three more.
In the Philippines today, there is a peace process happening. Very recently, the Philippine president has spoken and have celebrated the agreement with the Bangsamoro. And what was being held upon as that agreement is actually a framework of agreement in order to address the just and lasting peace in the Mindanao region. On the other hand, the peace process with the National Democratic Front in the Philippines has stalled. Since the time of the present president, there were several discussions and attempts to bring the two groups together in order to pursue the peace process. And what we could read on newspapers or even on the internet is the trying to consider surrender, right? You do not address peace process to say lay down of arms or ceasefire, but the peace process of the National Democratic Front has gone through stages since the time of President Ramos, wherein they have defined the Hague Agreement and then the Carhill or the Comprehensive Agreements on Human Rights and the Joint Agreement on Safety and Immunity Guarantees of the negotiators. So those kind of things should continue to pursue. And the first step in the pursuance of this peace is I go back to peace based on justice should start with number one, the release and amnesty of political prisoners, just like what the present, which is like what President Cory Aquino did, Nonoy's mother did when she assumed power, was the release of political prisoners. We need to pave way to be able to address that. And second, I think, is the long and overdue signing of President Nonoy Aquino of the Marcos Victims Compensation Bill. Those things should be pursued in order to show sincerity on the part of pursuing human rights in the Philippines.
About the action and about your question and also the comment from the Consul General. Both the Alston report, I'll go back to the Alston report, and then both the Alston report, but also the call of the people's movement, as well as even the insurgent movements, is for a peaceful way to resolve the issue. It's true that there is no formal structure, no formal policy of repression, so-called repression, or suspension of liberties in the Philippines. But the fact is, as we have demonstrated here, there is a repression that is happening, as demonstrated by the killing, by the arrest, the detention of those who speak out their mind, or those who act in ways that they believed is or the government is believed to its policies, and threatening it. It's true that the Philippines has the most progressive laws in the countries, in the world. It has environmental laws. It has anti-torture laws. And yet, almost all of these 300 prisoners, and last June, I was in the Philippines with May Melin over there. We visited one of the prisons where these political prisoners are being held, minimum security prison in Bilibid. And all of those prisoners that we met talked about being tortured during interrogation. And yet there is an anti-torture law. So what's happening? So I think the structure, the policy are there, but the performance, the implementation of these policies and laws are not happening. So that's a problem. So that's one of, that's what these are some of the issues that needs to be talked about in the peace process. If the insurgents are calling for peace talks, the two insurgents are calling for a peace talks. There are peace talks. One of them has happened. There is an agreement with the Moro Islamic Liberation Now. They just signed it 2 days ago or 3 days ago. The peace talks with the National Democratic Front and the Communist Party of the Philippines has stalled. And the democratic, that peace talk is supposed to, it has finished the human rights and humanitarian framework of the talks. It has been signed. Many of the provisions have not also been implemented. It's the next stage that they are supposed to enter is the economic talks. The fundamental, to talk about the fundamental economic problems of poverty, of unemployment, of all of those. How do we address this? And yet that has not been, for many, many reasons. Now it has not happened. So there is a call for continuance, resumption of the peace talks. And I think this is one of the things that we, Filipino community, but also the international community needs to do. And this is one of the things that we have been calling on the Canadian government. Push for the peace talks. Because, as it has been shown, for 40 years, the Philippine government has pursued a military solution to the problem of insurgency. It has not solved that problem. And our position is that only a peaceful negotiations would solve it. Talk about the fundamental problems, economic, political, cultural, social problems. And so that's needed for now, for us. Around how do we unify the people? In these peace talks, a number of churches, people's organization, human rights defenders, different groups have been gathering communities, people's organizations, different sectors to talk about the peace agenda that they are pushing for these peace talks. So there have been congresses, consultation across the country that churches are involved with about What are the agenda? What are the issues that Filipinos want the two or the three parties in this peace talk need to address and solve? And I think that's one way, unifying, a way of unifying Filipinos from across the country and different sectors around an agenda for peace. But it cannot be solved just by trying to eliminate through military solution the counterinsurgency. It will not happen.
Just quickly, maybe Tito, if you can answer the question of why hasn't things changed? The question of other countries in that period have changed. Why hasn't the Philippines changed? Just quickly, and then we're going to move on. A couple more questions.
I guess if there is anything that martial law has done, or the current situation has done, the positive thing that it has done for me is that the Filipino people have learned to really fight for their rights, no? And be vigilant about this. No? And this is where also we are confident, no? That in pursuing this, what Bern and Perry have mentioned, no? This next step in the peace process, no? Working towards fundamental changes in the socio-economic and later in the political fields, no? That it will be decisive. No? The role of the people, no? Will be very decisive. And I feel that it will be the most decisive, no? How the people push for this. No? Now, why have we not achieved change? My sense of this is that we only have to look at what Philippine society is still like, no? And what are the dominant forces there. No? For one, it remains the question of foreign domination and control is very much strong, no? In the Philippines. No? And this hold and control is over all spheres of life, not just in the economic, but also in the political, in the cultural fields. No, so much so that if we go back to the cultural, to Renato Constantino, we have read his writings. No, that even our consciousness has been so affected by this foreign domination and control.
So just for the purposes of time, we're at 8:09, so one question. Sorry, unless we have more time, we can do five more minutes. Okay, so we'll do 3 questions. I'll go to you.
Okay, I have a question about the counterinsurgency. As a Filipino Muslim myself, I can tell you that the more poverty that people experience, the more militant they would become. And it seems like the discussion about violence in Mindanao has been so centered upon crushing counterinsurgencies, when to my mind, if you give people schools, if you give people their essentials, if you give them houses and the opportunity to be free and study and food, they won't be so militant. And so for me, the question of counterinsurgency, it's not a matter of crushing counterinsurgencies. It's a matter of giving people provisions. So I agree that the solution is not going to come from the military. The policies have to shift from military to political, economic, and social. And my question is, what needs to happen to make this shift?
First of all, it's on? Okay. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody for sharing your stories, especially Tito Ricky and Tito Hermie. Well, before coming here, I was teaching for a few years in UP Diliman. And one trend that I was noticing in the students at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, these were kids that were born 91, 92, 93, 94, is what I would what I think is an alarming shift in attitudes towards authoritarianism. They would visit Singapore, they would visit Taiwan, they would visit South Korea, Malaysia, and they would say, well, authoritarianism is a good thing. I mean, look at what it did for these countries. Maybe it's high time that the Philippines reconsider democracy. I would have them write essays, like at the beginning of the class, asking them, what do you think is the main problem with the Philippines? And consistently, half of the students would tell me, or write in that piece of paper, that the problem of the Philippines is the Filipinos lack discipline and we need a strong iron fist. Now, if you had a chance to talk to these children, these students, what would you tell them?
As a complete outsider to like the Filipino culture, a couple things struck me. I guess from the Canadian perspective, similar linguistically, like as a Canadian, we have been told that like yeah, the Filipinos went through a lot of bad things, and like, but in the 70s, Marcos was exiled to Hawaii, and now there's a democracy, and like we are told that it's a bright and shining democracy in Asia. So how, like I've heard how it's not a democracy, and like no governmental democracy is perfect, but how is it a democracy? Like how can, as a Canadian, it be defined as a democracy? What's going on there now that makes it democratic? And then in the same like language, I guess, you mentioned that the one of the new name for the government contingency group was Bayanihan. It's also the name of your national dance company. What do you think what do you think the relationship between like naming a dance company to like a contingency group? Is there a relationship, or is it just the same word that was used?
Me?
Anyone. Whoever wants to answer.
François did not have any.
Great. As I tried to explain, there is having a system in what that happens substantively, right? If the so we elect a government here in Canada every 4 years, and we think that's great. We have democracy. Many things are done. Many things we don't know about. Many things we don't agree with. But we've elected the people that do them. And when we start agitating about it, for example, we complained about the fact that our armed troops were potentially, with their own knowledge, transferring detainees in Afghanistan to the Afghani troops, knowing, or at least having a pretty good idea that they would be tortured. Well, our governments decided to prorogue Parliament, right? We just stopped the debate. Right? So I think, okay, well, that's not really a democratic measure. Some people were not very happy with this. Now, what if this happens once in a while, and so, well, that's okay. You know, we're quite happy. We're rich, and most people are doing fine in this country, so we don't really mind. There are people that have problems, but you know, not enough that most people notice. Now, what if you're in a country where actually it's much harder for most people? The kind of situation that led to Canadian prorogation happens once in a while actually happens more than once in a while, right? And sometimes when it's brought to the floor, then we're not talking about it, or we're using different words, right? That's what I was trying to say in my talk. But then quite a few people are quite unhappy about this, right? To the point that they think that it's worth organizing, sometimes in what we would call violent ways, because they don't have what they need to survive, right? Or you know, in comparison to the rest of the world. They see corporations coming from abroad. That's how I got introduced to the Philippines, actually. I was in high school, and somebody from a group called the Subanen came to tell us in school that Rio Tinto, big mining company, which now Rio Tinto Alcan, so a Canadian tie, was actually expropriating, probably with the let's call it the complicity of the government, lost most of its land, right? The group had to move, right? They wanted to say what they could, but didn't have space to notice. So obviously they started to organize. And in the Philippines, it seems that there are many groups like this, right? So you might say, well, is that a democracy, right? And so I don't live in the Philippines. I mean, these people are much better placed, having lived themselves and gone through episodes and witnessing them firsthand to describe what the reality is on the ground. But it seems to me that the more people think that it's not democratic, well, the less democratic it is. And so it's for you, obviously, to make up your own mind of what you think democracy is. There's what we say democracy is, that is one election every 4 years, and what the Greeks thought democracy was, which is, you know, the people ruling themselves, and they might not have had that, but what does that really mean, the people ruling themselves, and who are these people?
So to quickly jump on that as an addendum, you mentioned the Subanons.
Yeah.
The Subanons are actually still in trouble with mining, or still having problems with mining. I visited a area in southern Mindanao just a few years ago in Zamboanga, and it's the Toronto Ventures Incorporated, a mining company, is actually operating on Subanon land there. And linking also to your democracy question, the law of the Philippines basically states that a foreign company cannot enter indigenous land without direct permission from the indigenous people, free, prior, informed consent. So TVI went to visit the Subanon, asked them for permission. Subanon said no. Luckily for the Philippine government, there's a clause in the Indigenous Peoples Act that basically says the Philippine government decides who the leadership of the indigenous people are. So they basically chose other Subanons from other areas, appointed them the leaders of the Subanons in this area. They signed the Memorandum of Agreement, and since 2001, the Toronto Ventures Incorporated has been operating on the holy mountain of the Subanon people. So that's a glimpse of the democracy that's happening in the Philippines. Does anyone want to answer either of the other two questions?
Around the question of fundamental change, you know, economic, social, political, how do we try to move that? What we've seen that the change does not come from those in government, those elected to parliament, those elected to Congress. A key actor of change are the people. And so there is a need, and I think for us here, both for Canada and the Philippines, we need to educate the people about what needs to be changed. We need to bring people to act for change. Although right now, when you do that, then you get targeted, right? So that's one of the issues. So it's very important for people to be politically educated, politically informed, politically aware, politically educated, and politically engaged. And all of us have a role in that. For those who are Filipinos, people of Filipino descent here, you are here, but you can also help the people in the Philippines, you know. For Canadians, what we believe, and that's why we have been advocating here in Canada, is that sometimes nothing works in the Philippines. And so when we had Philippine delegation from the Philippines of Human Rights and church representatives, they said, we are here in Canada and we are going around the world because we have exhausted all means in the Philippines to bring attention to this issue. Nothing has worked. And so we need international pressure. And that's for us in Canada. We need to tell the world, we need the world to tell the Philippine government that the world is watching and that we want change. And for us, and that can be simply like signing a petition, writing letters, or representing to your members of parliament.
So it is now 8:20, so I'm going to give the last two speakers just a quick moment to give their final thoughts, and then I think we'll have to wrap up for tonight. And I think if anyone's interested in learning more, you can talk to them after the fact, and I'm sure you can get together at a future time to discuss.
Just to to sum that up, no, especially what Bern just said, how to move things forward. I believe that over the years, no, there have been several arenas of action that we can look at, no, through which change, no, at different levels and in different forms have been achieved. No? One, of course, there are people who have taken to the hills. No? There are people who have taken to the hills for their own reasons, no? And also because of the violence that they have experienced. No? Two, there is the parliamentary arena. We have the arena of elections. No? We have, in fact, in the Philippines, there is now the party list system where the people's organizations are able to put their representatives, no, in the parliament. No? Three, there is also the arena of what we call the parliament of the streets, no? The mass movements, no? The mass actions. No? And it has been proven, and we have seen in the experience of 1986, no, at EDSA, that such mass movements, no, can put things, no, in place, can move things forward. No? Fourth, there is the arena of the peace process. No? The negotiations between the state, no, the ruling state, and the people's movements, no, towards working towards fundamental changes. And fifth, as Bern said, there is that arena of international solidarity, which we have been also working on, no, to get international public opinion in favor of change, no? Change for the people's interests.
Two things I'd like to address the bayanihan question. When the government of Gloria Macapagal Arroyo launched her counterinsurgency, she called it Oplan Bantaylaya 1. And when it failed, it calls it Oplan Bantaylaya 2. So I'm going to answer your question with what would Noynoy Aquino call if Oplan Bayanihan fails. It might be called Bayanihan 2, dance troop also. And the last question, I'd like to refer to the what's the problem of the Filipino people? We in Migrante, an alliance of 17 organizations of which I represent as their Secretary General, always believe that the problem of the Filipino people is a lack of decent jobs in their country, lack of genuine industrialization and genuine land reform, which forces 4,000 Filipinos to leave the country every day.
Bayanihan is not a name of the dance troupe. It's the word for communities, people working together. Unfortunately, it has been appropriated to the contrary of dividing them.
So thank you everyone for coming. Thank you to François, to Rick, to Perry, to Bern. Thank you to Professor Kelly and YCAR for putting this together.